Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up and coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And last Friday, I went to see the Odyssey, and here's my review. Not gay enough. But in all seriousness, not that I was being particularly unserious on that part, the not gay enough part, I saw The Odyssey. This is the latest prestige production from Christopher Nolan, a sprawling modern adaptation shot entirely in IMAX 70mm of the ancient Greek poet Homer's epic of the same name, named after its hero Odysseus, the legendary Achaean king, who the epic follows from his victory during the Trojan War through his many mishaps and misadventures on his long voyage back to the kingdom of Ithaca. Unlike the poem itself, Nolan's adaptation is arranged in a non-chronological fashion, not dissimilar from previous projects of his. Much of the material for the film is not actually from Homer's poem itself, but rather liberally derived from other sources attributed both to Homer as well as other sources from Greek antiquity, and that includes the foundational opening of the film, which sees the iconic Trojan horse designed by Odysseus being discovered and retrieved by the Trojans, believing it to be a pathetic offering of loss by the retreating Achaeans. Obviously, Odysseus and his men are inside the belly of it, and the Trojans are, in fact, welcoming their own sudden doom after some 10 years of successfully resisting the Achaean forces. But from there, the episodic journey of Odysseus, played by Matt Damon, is told in flashback structure from parallel points of view. The first, Odysseus himself, having already aged some 20 years since leaving Ithaca, the sole remaining survivor of his crew, his memories only just trickling back to him after being marooned on an island controlled by the demigod Calypso, and then, back in Ithaca, from the vantage of Odysseus's queen Penelope, Anne Hathaway, and his mature son Telemachus, Tom Holland, they in turn attempt to fend off the growing tumult and perfidy of a horde of suitors, all seeking to wrest the throne of Ithaca from the presumed ghost of the lost king. And that's only kind of the broad strokes of how the narrative is framed, but Nolan's non-chronological editing actually becomes a lot more complex as the Odyssey stretches on. He'll sometimes reenact scenes more than once to show different perspectives on it. Even as we learn more and more about Odysseus's journey, we are also constantly flashing back even further to the sacking of Troy itself as this dark, repressed memory that serves as a haunting thematic through line informing the drama, and to such a degree that it becomes progressively more apparent that Nolan is avoiding the classical sword and sandals tact of presenting his interpretation of the Odyssey as a series of adventures, as encounters and fights with weird monsters and magic. The most modern aspect of Nolan's production ends up being that it's not about a hero's journey. Those classic Greek themes of pride and hubris and fate are certainly quite apparent and echo the often dualistic purpose that these myths often served in antiquity, to both extol great heroic achievements while teaching important lessons and values by the negative example of how these heroes destroy themselves. But from his 21st century vantage point, Nolan is clearly more interested in presenting Damon's Odysseus as a truly modern anti-heroic figure, a character we can at once sympathize with and even admire to a certain degree. He's presented as a decidedly humble monarch, someone who doesn't want to go to war but knows that he's not strong enough to oppose the psychopathic Achaean leader Agamemnon, here played by Benny Safdie as this towering, virtually silent golem dressed entirely in this imposing black armor. He's emotionally nurturing of his wife Penelope and even pleads with her to remarry if he doesn't come back. He's most famous for his skills as an archer, but even when hunting, he'll give a nice little tunic pluck of his bowstring to let the quarry know he's there because he's convinced that it's a fairer thing to do. Inevitably, though, the way Nolan structures his interpretation not only makes for some pretty insightful poetical parallels between episodes and imagery, giving a more emotionally complex, symbolic resonance to his film that I think fairly decently adapts that feeling when you are reading about Greek mythology. And very often you have to read into it emotional perspectives and psychological motives that aren't there in a text that is primarily about recording personages and actions and events in a very didactic way, and where there's this mystique of deep history where you feel so far from the values of the time, but can still kind of recognize haunting parallels between the human condition of the past and the present. More so, presenting the epic in the way that Nolan does forces the audience to see the film as a revealing of Odysseus for who he really is, which is not simply the sum of his great acts and experiences, but of his deeply flawed and contradictory character. The very first thing that Odysseus is able to recall to Calypso, played by Charlize Theron, the very first thing he remembers after leaving Troy is that he and his men chase away the members of and then pillage and burn down a random village for the crime of being so scared of seeing a group of advancing, dirty, bronze-clad soldiers, and thus refusing them that seminal Greek virtue of hospitality. That's another big theme of the movie, especially as it's told in parallel with the experiences of Penelope and Telemachus, the degree to which the laws of Achaean society, Zeus's laws defining how people are supposed to demonstrate their civility to one another, while some people may follow them in earnest, they seem to typically be used by the powerful as a means of performing virtue as a pretext for imposing their superiority onto others. This isn't even a particularly new interpretation of Homer's Odyssey. The Romans conquered the Greeks, and the ancient Romans ended up presenting Homer's works as demonstrative of the treachery of the ancient Achaeans, and given how well that very romantic interpretation seems to gel through millennia with Nolan's new modern anti-hero version of Odysseus, when he lays out these episodes of mythology the way he does, it's kind of hard to not see the obvious point there. No, really, if you could boil down Nolan's Odyssey, it's basically, for all of its rather artful and poetic juxtaposition of framings, of perspectives on the present and the past through these various mythological characters, it's a version of the Odyssey that is all about Odysseus and his dumbass crew f***ing around and finding out constantly, always rolling up on other people's shit, acting like they own the place, and then being surprised when they get their shit wrecked, or find out that somebody they with is actually some god's child. If the ultimate lesson of classical tragedy is that your heroic deeds will never ring out as loud and as long in history as how your own pride destroyed you, the inspired and timely message of Nolan's production is that nobody will remember your private virtues as a person as much as the horror you inflicted in the name of following power for its own sake, typified rather exquisitely in a confrontation between Odysseus and the sorceress Circe, played by Samantha Morton, in a sequence that not only manages to hammer home the haunting implications of the hero's journey that Nolan is deconstructing for us, but also the echoes of the Odyssey throughout so much of fantasy literature and even film. This is a sequence that makes you realize that even if you've never read the Odyssey, you've probably felt its haunting shadows stretching all the way from the opening of Dante's Divine Comedy to Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland to George Orwell's Animal Farm to even Hayao Miyazaki's Spirited Away. I found much of the Odyssey variously entertaining, impactful, and even fascinating, but unfortunately, I don't think I can recommend it on merits much higher than that sort of essayistic quality of it as a self-aware deconstruction of the legacy of classical mythology and how it can resonate to the present moment, especially with regards to the Western world's own tortured but always symbolically sublimated guilt over the horrors that we have executed in the recent past in the name of some heroic or patriotic virtue. virtue. As an interestingly structured fantasy production, though, I think the Odyssey is considerably held back by Nolan's inadequacies as a screenwriter. His dialogue isn't terrible here, but there is an extent to which it feels overburdened by its self-awareness. This is a movie where characters literally say things like, "Our civilization is collapsing." For every inspired bit of poetical finesse that Nolan is able to pull out, and primarily again through visual juxtaposition, you can always rely upon a certain tone deafness on his part, whether he's writing the script or not, to let a little air out of the tires of that stuff. This is also a movie that does things like the old gag of a character saying something about a dog and then giving the dog a reaction shot where it tilts its head with its ears up and goes, "Rrr." Despite how haunting the implications of Nolan's narrative increasingly become, there's this never-resting sense of his being torn between impulses as a commercial filmmaker to do cutesy stuff like this, and then trying and failing to suggest something more meditative by simply having characters overstate themes. Despite how much of the story is presented in terms of diving deep into the well of this character's memory and settling into a very conflicted examination of what his actions suggest about his psychology and the values of the world around him, the Odyssey feels remarkably impersonal in its presentation, and I think a lot of that comes down to the format on which it was shot, that epic, big, square box of IMAX 70mm. I'm not about to tell anybody that there aren't certainly a lot of striking cinematic moments that Nolan and returning cinematographer Hoyt van Hoytema are able to pull off here. I'm thinking especially of simply the arduous sight of the Trojans pulling the black wooden horse out of the sands and back to the kingdom of Troy, or a particularly exceptional episode of Odysseus and his remaining crew literally going to hell to summon the spirits of their fallen comrades. But much of the Odyssey pretty much just seems to exemplify that IMAX film formats are generally great for depicting the natural world, whereas no matter how much the camera technology for filming in these large formats might have improved to give commercial filmmakers greater flexibility when shooting character drama and especially action, it's obvious to me, at least, that it's still so large and still requires such a pulled back perspective when shooting that it inevitably runs up against the fact that Nolan himself has neither been a particularly stylistic director, tending to emphasize function over form, nor a consistently good director of action especially. I don't think it quite works, at least when Nolan is trying to do a meditative, metatextual fantasy drama. I think what it does is it heightens his already rather dry and impersonal style of filmmaking by basically boxing him into a position where the very scope of the image that is supposed to transmit this epic feeling also means that much of the Odyssey ends up feeling like a kind of bland presentation of elements rather than a more intimate exploration of them that can communicate a kind of cinematic subjectivity. Nolan also seems to be doubling down on his use of very shallow depth of field in certain scenes, often to the extreme that, just like with Oppenheimer before it, he actually seems to want a lot of the elements of a shot, even when it's just a close-up of a character, to be out of critical focus, so that the lack of focus, that hurried nature of trying to get a clarity that is never truly perfected, becomes part of the beauty of the image and what it's trying to express about a character or a scene. The thing is, though, I think that what made that work so well with Oppenheimer is that for the first time in many years, Nolan was mounting a project in which he couldn't rely on his clear surface-level fascination with natural edifices and technology or pop culture iconography. He had to build up his vision from first principles of a contained biographical drama. And in so doing, he really achieved something quite exceptional with Oppenheimer, not just for him, but for that sort of biographical drama writ large. He went to places in terms of the development of his style that felt more intimate and connected to the subject in a way that he had just never achieved before working exclusively on thriller and fantasy pictures. Whereas there are so many action sequences in the Odyssey, and drawn out ones to boot, where I think the point of similarly shooting at night or in extreme low light interior settings with a very shallow depth of field is to do like a fog of war thing, but all it manages to accomplish in my eyes is render these supposedly brutal moments that should be more intimate and impactful, given that the haunting overarching theme of this story is the specter of inhumanity and violence following us, no matter how much these characters try to deny it and compartmentalize it and rationalize it. They end up being presented in terms of a kind of baroque, murky generality that are sometimes downright illegible. Nolan not being able to choreograph a wide or clear enough shot, and cutting away too quickly on action in just what turns out to be a really disappointing expose on his chronic handicap as a director who likes making action-heavy movies, but where he is just so consistently mediocre or even downright lazy as an action director. This same guy is still envisioning and executing action sequences as if the point is to cut around your own inadequacies. I also just don't think a lot of the cast can manage to do much with Nolan's more leaden moments of prose. I think the core trio of Damon, Hathaway, and Holland are left considerably wanting in terms of making us believe in them as jumping off the screen as these characters in a time of apparent magic. I think they're way too languid and naturalistic in their approach. Someone like the reliable Robert Pattinson as the suitor Antinous seems to take advantage of Nolan's storied lack of interference with his actors' interpretations of their roles to just chew the scenery to pieces. That's really one of the few aspects where I think Nolan's conflicting cornball Hollywood sentimentality and vision of pessimism actually works in a single character. It's really funny how much racist cuck heads were trying to use Troy to rage bait people over the casting of the movie, because Pattinson seems to be one of the few people with enough actual self-reflection to know, no, this is a ridiculous Hollywood pomp piece, right? We're supposed to be over the top. We're not doing this like it's some kind of allegory for the war on terror and the experiences of returning veterans, right? Right? We're not doing that, right? Elliot Page honestly comes off the best in the cast despite very little screen time, which is appropriate because he gets the best written scene in the picture, and the one where a performer actually manages to project out from the impersonal way that Nolan goes about presenting so much of the story. And I'm not quite sure, but I think even nestled in his dialogue is supposed to be an even much darker implication about what Odysseus as a man of his times is capable of. How he's able to manipulate and misuse people while always rationalizing it to himself. And I don't just mean based on the treachery we see depicted in the film. I mean something that seems to be implied by how Page's character describes his love for Odysseus, but then again, I might just be reading a little too much into it for fear of less to talk about. The Odyssey just kind of came off as kind of ironic for me, because as an epic, it felt so limited, and as a commercial fantasy picture, it felt so obvious and tone deaf. And then as a more metatextual kind of Hollywood prestige picture, it felt just as didactic and impersonal. It doesn't own either being over the top or trenchant and haunting well enough. Also, yeah, not gay enough. I can't believe it's been 20 years since Oliver Stone's Alexander, and we still haven't had a prestige sword and sandal epic with two guys who are explicitly in love with each other. I'm giving the Odyssey a appreciative 3 out of 5. I think it's decent overall, more than worth the investment of seeing it. There are a lot of interesting features of it you'll have fun picking apart long after you've seen it, though. Anyway, I'm getting out of here. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.